town of Ludlow had an unseasonable chill that Halloween night. A biting cold seeped into your skin. It left you feeling hollow. Emily huddled close, wrapped in my jacket. Her laughter trailed behind us in small puffs of breath. Those breaths melted into the fog like tiny ghosts of joy. She looked beautiful. Her eyes were bright with the thrill of the walk. Her cheeks were flushed from the crisp air. If I'd known what was coming, I might have held her tighter. I would have savored every step. But hindsight's a cruel bastard. It only whispers in your ear once it's too late. We left the Halloween party late. We decided to walk home down the fog-drenched back roads. The streets were quiet. Only small towns get that kind of empty after dark. I remember thinking it was safe. The kind of safety that lulls you into a false sense of security. Then came the headlights. They tore through the mist, twin beams barreling toward us, fierce and fast. My first instinct was to pull her closer, but my brain couldn't catch up with my body. The car was already upon us. I felt her slip from my grasp as the car struck her. The force sent her sprawling across the road like a broken doll. But it didn't stop there. The car swerved. Instead of braking, the tires skidded. They dragged her across the rough pavement. The driver struggled to regain control. I heard the sickening scrape of her skin against the asphalt. I saw her limbs twist in ways no human body should. Her face was caught in a silent scream. The vehicle finally jerked to a halt. The wheels kept spinning. It was as though her life hadn't just been torn from her body. I don't remember moving. Suddenly I was there, kneeling beside her. I stared at the bloody trail that stretched across the road. Her body was mangled. Her face was barely recognizable beneath the blood and dirt. Her clothes were shredded and stained. Her chest was still. Her limbs twisted, lifeless. I was frozen. I couldn't process the horror sprawled out before me. I don't remember screaming. Later, they told me I did. I just remember looking at her. The cold seeped in, settling in my bones. The car sat idling down the road. The driver stumbled out. He was pale and shaking. His mouth moved, but no sound reached me. All I could hear was the pounding of my own heart. The silence was endless. By the time the sirens filled the air, she was gone. The days after blurred together. People stopped by with condolences. They brought casseroles, murmured words that felt distant. It was like listening from underwater. They'd look at me with sympathy in their eyes. But as soon as I turned, I'd catch them glancing at the clock. They were eager to escape, and I'd just stand there, trapped in the memory of her lifeless body. Her blood was drying in the cracks of the pavement. Sleep became a distant memory. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her face, bloodied and twisted. Her hand reached out as if I could still save her. By the third day, I was ready to do anything to see her alive again. That's when I remembered the stories, the ones about the pet cemetery, that eerie spot on the edge of town that people avoided after sunset. They said that land was old. They said the dead didn't rest there. If anyone knew the truth, it would be Jed Crandall. He lived in a sagging, crooked house just past the town's edge. His yard was scattered with rusted tools and abandoned relics. It was a patchwork of past lives. People said he was half mad. Maybe grief had driven me mad too. I found myself at his door, staring at the peeling paint and warped wood. I felt like I'd stepped into a place I wasn't meant to be. Jed opened the door. His gaze was heavy and knowing. It was as if he could see the desperation eating away at me. He didn't say a word. He just nodded and led me in. He poured me a drink in a glass clouded with dust. He settled across from me in the dim, quiet room. "So," he finally said, his voice rough, almost resigned, "you lost her?" I didn't answer right away. My throat felt tight. I just nodded. I stared into the amber liquid. I wondered if it could burn away the hole that had opened inside me. "There's something about that land up there," he said. His eyes were fixed on some distant memory. "Pet cemetery. It don't hold on to the dead like it should. It brings things back, but not like they were." He let the words hang heavy in the air. His gaze turned sharp as he studied my face. "But don't go thinking that's a gift, son. I've seen what comes back. It ain't her you'll find. Not really. I'd heard the stories, the warnings about animals coming back wrong. But grief has a way of deafening you. It drowns out every sound except the one that calls you forward." All I could think of was Emily, her laugh, her warmth, the way she'd press her forehead against mine and say we had forever. "It brought them back, though," I murmured, more to myself than to him. My mind raced ahead of my fears. Jed leaned closer. His voice dropped low. "Sometimes dead is better," he whispered. It sounded like he was confessing a sin. His eyes were dark with something haunted. "You go messing with what's meant to rest, and you'll find yourself in a hell you can't claw your way out of." But his words fell on deaf ears. They were absorbed into the empty ache that had hollowed me out. The world without Emily was cold and lifeless. The thought of seeing her, hearing her voice again, outshined every warning, every whisper of dread. When I left, his words trailed behind me like smoke. They faded as I stepped into the night. Sometimes dead is better. The night had an unnatural stillness as I made my way to the cemetery. A shovel was in my hand. The air was damp. It was thick with the kind of chill that clings to your bones. It made you feel like you're being watched. Every shadow seemed to stretch just a little too far. Every sound, a twig snapping, a leaf crunching underfoot, felt like a warning. I was too far gone to heed it. The rational part of me screamed to turn back. It was the part that had once been content with the world's simple rules of life and death. But Jed's words echoed in my mind like a taunt. Sometimes dead is better. It wasn't enough. Not for me. Not for Emily. As I approached her grave, I gripped the shovel tightly. My knuckles ached. Her headstone stood stark and lonely under the pale light. A slab of polished stone declared a life reduced to a beginning and an end. I didn't let myself think about what I was about to do. I didn't think about what I might find. Thinking would break me. The first shovel full of dirt felt like sacrilege. The sound of it falling back to the ground was far too loud in the quiet night. I kept digging, each muscle strained. Beads of sweat traced icy trails down my back. I lost track of time. The shovel moved in a hypnotic rhythm. It dulled the ache in my chest. All I could think about was her face, the way she'd looked at me, laughed with me. It was like we had all the time in the world. Then the shovel hit something solid. A dull thud sent a shock up my arms. It shattered my trance. I paused, breathing hard. My heart pounded so loud, it drowned out the silence. My hands trembled as I reached down. I cleared away the last thin layer of dirt with my fingers. And then, there she was. Her coffin sat like a dark scar in the earth. It was a boundary I wasn't meant to cross. I hesitated. My fingers hovered over the edge. The weight of what I was doing pressed down on me, but I couldn't stop. Not now. I pried open the lid. The wood creaked, stiff and reluctant. It was as if even it knew I was breaking something sacred. The sight of her nearly undid me. Her body lay there, twisted and broken from the accident. She was frozen in the position they'd placed her in. Her face was pale and expressionless. Her skin was waxy, almost translucent. It was a thin veil stretched over the brutal wounds the car had left behind. Her hair was matted, strands tangled and caked with dried blood. I tried to see through it all. I tried to remember the girl I loved. But reality was unforgiving. For a brief, horrifying moment, I almost let go of the idea entirely. Then the cold settled in. It numbed my grief into a desperate need. I couldn't leave her like this. She was torn, empty, a shell of who she'd been. I'd seen Jed's eyes when he warned me. I couldn't shake the hope that maybe, somehow, she'd come back different for me. She had to. I took a deep, shuddering breath. I slid my arms beneath her. She was heavier than I'd remembered. Her body was stiff, unyielding. Every instinct screamed to drop her, to walk away and leave her at peace. But I forced myself to hold on. The earth seemed to pull at us as I lifted her. It wanted her back. It knew the place she belonged. The trek to the pet cemetery was a blur. It was a nightmarish procession through the woods. It felt like stepping into another world. The trees loomed around me. Their branches clawed at the sky. The silence felt alive. It pressed in, amplifying every labored breath, every creak of her body in my arms. By the time I reached the old burial ground, my limbs were numb. My mind was a chaotic mess of hope and horror. I laid her gently in the shallow, uneven hole I'd dug. I couldn't meet her face. I couldn't confront what I was doing. The ground felt wrong beneath my feet. It was too soft, like it could swallow us both whole if it wanted. And maybe it did. As I covered her with dirt, I whispered to her. The words barely registered. They were promises, apologies, pleas, anything that might reach her, wherever she was. I pressed the final handful of earth down. I packed it tight. I pressed as if the weight of my hands could anchor her to this place, to this world. The night was heavy with expectation. The air was thick and silent. It was as if the world itself was waiting. I stood there for a long time. I watched the disturbed earth. I expected something to shift, to breathe, to pulse with the promise I'd made. But there was nothing, just the wind rustling through the trees, the faint smell of decay, the cold, empty silence that had followed me here. In that moment, Jed's words came back. They were more vivid than ever. Sometimes dead is better. But I told myself he didn't know. He didn't know her. He didn't understand. This wasn't just some twisted joke from the past. It wasn't something to scare kids into respecting the dead. This was Emily, and she would come back. She had to. When I finally turned away, the wind picked up. It was cold and sharp, like a whisper I couldn't quite make out. I forced myself to keep walking. I left her there, trusting she would find her way back to me. As I stepped into the shadows of the forest, I felt the cold settle in again. But this time, it wasn't the night. It was something deeper, something that clung to me. It wrapped itself around my bones. I told myself it was just the grief, just the emptiness. But as I walked back to town, that cold lingered. It crawled into my veins. It settled behind my eyes, as if some part of me knew I'd made a mistake. Halloween night arrived again, a week to the day since I buried her in that twisted patch of earth. town was alive with noise and color. Kids laughed, running down the streets in costumes. Neighbors chatted from doorsteps. But to me, the world felt muted. Each sound was distant. Each face blurred like I was seeing them from the other side of a veil. I'd been haunted by dreams every night since then. Dreams where she would appear at the edge of my bed. Her face was just barely recognizable under the decay. She called my name in that soft voice of hers. In each dream, she'd reach out to me. Her fingers were cold and stiff. Her touch scraped against my skin like frostbite. I'd wake up drenched in sweat. Her voice echoed in my ears, but they were just dreams. That's what I told myself anyway. That night, I stayed home. The lights were off, curtains drawn. I wanted to drown out the world outside. I'd barely sat down when I heard it. A knock at the door. It was soft, hesitant. The kind of knock you'd expect from a visitor who wasn't sure they were welcome. I froze. My heart pounded so loud it drowned out everything else. I didn't want to believe it. I didn't want to even think it was possible. But a small, twisted part of me, the part that had clung to Jed's story like a lifeline, made me rise to my feet. Each step toward the door felt like a descent into something dark and unnatural. The knock came again, more insistent. I could feel the air thickening. It pressed down on me like a weight. I reached for the handle. My hand trembled as I gripped it. The cold metal bit into my skin. When I opened the door, she was standing there. Emily, or what was left of her. Her face was pale, almost translucent under the porch light. Her hair hung in tangled, matted clumps. It was streaked with dried blood and dirt. Her eyes, God, her eyes were dark, hollow. They locked onto mine with an intensity that made my breath catch. She stood there, swaying slightly. Her arms hung stiff at her sides. Her fingers were curled like claws. "Max," she whispered. Her voice was brittle, almost mechanical. It was like a tape replayed too many times. I couldn't speak. My throat felt tight. My words were trapped in my chest. I wanted to reach out. I wanted to pull her close. But there was something wrong. Something horribly, grotesquely wrong. Her skin looked stretched. It was taut over bones that jutted out at unnatural angles. There was a strange, sweet rot in the air. A smell clung to her, thick and suffocating. She took a step forward. Her body jerked slightly. Her movements were stiff and unnatural. Each step echoed in the silent house. It was a hollow sound that made my blood run cold. "Emily?" My voice was barely a whisper. As soon as I said her name, I wished I hadn't. Her face twisted, her mouth stretched into a smile. It was too wide, too forced. It was as if she'd forgotten what a smile was supposed to look like. She reached out. Her hand brushed against my cheek. Her touch was like ice. It was a sharp, piercing cold that made my skin crawl. "I came back," she whispered. Her voice was thick, words drawn out slowly. It was as if she were tasting each syllable. I swallowed. I tried to hold on to the memory of who she'd been. The girl who'd laughed and smiled and made the world feel bright. But standing before me now was a hollowed-out version, a parody of the warmth I'd lost. The light in her eyes had been replaced by something darker, something I didn't recognize, something that felt wrong. I stumbled back. She followed. She stepped into the house. Her gaze never left mine. She moved in that same jerky, stiff manner. Her feet scraped against the floor. Her fingers twitched by her sides. The air grew colder as she came closer. That sickly sweet smell filled the room. It made my stomach turn. I backed up until my spine pressed against the wall. My breaths were shallow and rapid. Her hand reached out. It brushed against my chest. Her touch felt like frost spreading through me. It chilled me to my core. "I waited for you," she murmured. Her voice was soft, almost tender. There was an edge to it, a bitterness that made my skin prickle. "Emily, I didn't know what to say. Every thought was swallowed by the horror standing in front of me. I realized that the thing I'd brought back wasn't Emily. Not really. Not anymore." Her eyes narrowed. A flicker of something cold and furious crossed her face. "You left me," she said. Her voice was low, a hint of accusation creeping into her words. "No, I didn't want to," I stammered. I struggled to find words that wouldn't shatter under the weight of her gaze. She took another step closer. Her fingers grazed the edge of my jaw. Her touch was rough and unfeeling. "It was dark," she whispered. Her voice was almost childlike. It was a strange, unsettling innocence that twisted something inside me. Cold. My chest tightened as I felt her fingers dig into my skin. Her nails scraped against me, leaving trails of icy fire in their wake. Her face was inches from mine. Her eyes bore into me with a hatred that hadn't been there before. There was a hunger that went beyond the grave. I tried to pull away. She pressed closer. Her grip tightened. I could feel the chill radiating from her. It seeped into my bones. Her face twisted into that too wide, unnatural smile. "I came back for you," she murmured. Her voice dropped to a low, guttural whisper that made my skin crawl. It was then that I realized the full horror of what I'd done. The girl I'd loved, the girl I'd wanted so desperately to bring back, was gone. In her place stood something twisted, something soulless. It was a mockery wearing her face, her voice, her memories. All at once I remembered Jed's words, the warning he'd tried so hard to drill into me. Sometimes dead is better. But it was too late. Emily's smile widened. Her hand slid down to my throat. Her grip was iron tight as her face loomed closer. Her breath was a cold fog that froze me in place. Her eyes were wild, dark pits filled with a terrible, unquenchable need. In that moment, I knew. I knew with every fiber of my being. She was no longer my Emily. I had brought her back, but I'd brought something else with her. Something that didn't belong in the world of the living. As her fingers tightened around my throat, her whispered words filled the silence. They echoed in the empty spaces of my mind. They carved a dark, inescapable truth into my soul. "I came back for you, Max,"